Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the introduction. So I will tell you a bit about what we are doing and what we have done with the Swiss university hospitals, now being extended also to other European countries and also in UK, US countries, in order to marry these ideas of, for example, the European health data spaces, how to make data available for secondary use, while still protecting privacy and keeping the privacy rights of individuals that are collaborating in research analysis or that are making the data available for these kind of experiences. And this is typically a conundrum, or is presented as a conflict, because the typical idea that people get when talking about sharing data is the traditional model of sharing data, moving all the data to a central place and then running there the algorithm or running there the protocol in order to extract the information that will bring a response to the clinical question or to the research question that is posed. And this presents a lot of issues. First, how we effectively anonymize this data in order to minimize the risks of exposure and re-identification of the patients or research subjects. And second, how we transfer all this data between different potentially regulatory environments. We're talking about cross-border collaborations, for example. And this is typically either impossible or it will take a long time to do effectively. So what we propose, and the systems that we have built in collaboration with the Swiss Personalized Health Network bring, is a fully federated architecture. So there's no need to access the raw data and to transfer the raw data in order to respond, to get the response to the clinical question or research question that is posed. So let's keep the data local. Let's keep the data under the controller control and avoid transfer of raw data outside of the security perimeter of this controller. And this is made possible thanks to a combination of multiple technologies. I will go a bit into detail of these technologies later on in the next slide. But basically, we're avoiding the transmission, the transfer of any raw individual data and transferring only the minimal information that is required in order to respond to the clinical question. And this combination is basically is brought together by this software module that can be deployed at each clinical site that is collaborating. Let's say that we have multiple hospitals that want to collaborate together, and each of them has a large database of patients that is not enough to respond to a given clinical question. So they need to engage in a multi-site analysis, but they cannot transfer the patient data outside of their own clinical site, outside of the hospital. So this software is linked to this database and is the one that will prevent any transfer of any raw data, any patient data outside of the perimeter of the hospital. And the first technique that is used here is this aggregation of federated analytics, federated learning. So instead of moving the data to the algorithm, we move the algorithm to the data. So we already compute locally the contribution to the function, the contribution to the analysis that is brought by all the patients, all the sub-cohort present in each of the clinical sites. This means that we already have aggregate data. We don't have individual patient-level data anymore. On top of that, we run homomorphic encryption. And this is a kind of malleable encryption that lets you compute on the encrypted data without having to decrypt it first. So this means that we can do the process without looking into the data and extract the final result that is the only information that can be decrypted at the end. And this is applied for any aggregate information that goes out. So this means that no individual record would be sent out and no clear text information would ever be sent out of the hospital. We also apply secure multi-party computation to share the decryption keys. So how do we make it possible to decrypt the result of the analysis? And this we make it by distributing the trust across all the different sites so that each of them has a piece of the key needed to decrypt the data. And this means that unless all of them agree in extracting the final result, this result cannot be decrypted by any of them individually. So this brings this trust distribution and trust cooperation across all sites only based on the technology and not based on a data transfer agreement or based on written or signed agreements. And finally, we also apply disclosure prevention techniques at the output. So once that we can obtain the result of a computation, still under encryption, we apply differential privacy, for example, that is adding a controlled amount of noise to the output so that we can arbitrarily reduce or minimize the probability of re-identification of any of the patients, any of the individual records that was present at the original databases. And this is what will guarantee that the output result can be considered either anonymous or not re-identifiable. And this is something that we have applied, as I said, in Switzerland, across Swiss university hospitals, also extending now to cantonal hospitals, and bringing also beyond the Swiss borders to France, Italy, UK, and US. And they can re-enable the collaborations as multi-site analysis in a much more timely and effective way without exposing or having to send or transfer any individual patient data. But it can also re-enable collaborations with pharma and collaborations even with insurers. And here we also have contracts dealing with value-based healthcare between hospitals and insurers, bridging the trust gap and avoiding the disclosure or the exposure of any individual patient-level data to insurers. That will never be done for the risk of discrimination that that can entail. So this means that we can re-enable these collaborations without the risks of the collaborations. And of course, this is also applicable in all the domains that deal with either regulated data or confidential data, like cybersecurity, talking about alerts, indicators of compromise, and also financial services, talking about fraud detection, anti-money laundering. But today, the most interesting case is that of healthcare. And I will bring an example on how, and a brief demo on how the system works very shortly, and how we can enable both feasibility and analysis in a much faster way than what it can be done today, that typically takes either months or years to get access to the data. And again, access to the raw data is not needed in order to respond to the question. So this is a brief demo on how our interface works, where the clinicians would connect to the system, see the connected hospitals that are where data has been made available for secondary use, define the database, define the concepts that are needed in order to execute an analysis, and define inclusion-exclusion criteria based on those concepts. And this is what can define the cohort that will be automatically computed across all sites using all these techniques that I mentioned before in order to provide an answer that is also protected with differential privacy. So that this answer, we can control that the re-identification probability is low enough or is minimized enough in order to consider it fully anonymous. And this again can automate the whole process without having to go through data transfer agreements just to find that the amount of available data is not enough in order to carry out the analysis. And this is the first step, very simple computation, so there's no machine learning here. Very simple computation, but that already enables this first step that is very difficult to get through in a typical traditional setting. If we go to more complex analysis, so once that we have identified the cohort, we know that it is available across all hospitals, we can define a custom process. And this means that we can go directly into the platform to a Python environment where we can define which was the cohort that was identified in the previous step. The notebook is already populated with how to perform the analysis in a federated and secure way across all sites, and we can share this workflow that goes together with the privacy policies, so which are the techniques that are applied in order to protect the data, so the authorized computations, the minimum dataset size in order to avoid a very small population or very small cohort that would present too much leakage, and how to control also the differential privacy that is applied at the output in order to minimize the re-identification. And then the analyst can define the whole process directly in Python using the Python SDK, as they would do normally with a local analysis, but it will be run directly on the local data at each of the hospitals in a federated way and automatically aggregated across all sites in order to get the final result. And this also brings the advantage that the DPO, the decision makers at the hospitals, the data controllers or the principal investigators that are in control of the data, they can make a decision based on this standardized information and homogeneous information that represents an automated way of having a data management plan and a data protection impact assessment on what is done throughout the whole life cycle of the data in order to respond to the analysis of the researcher. And this case in particular, yeah, if it goes, yes. So it's a case of international collaboration for dermatology, where the Swiss hospitals were prevented from exporting data about Swiss patients in order to engage with with other international hospitals where other skin tones and other affections that were not present or representative enough in Switzerland could be used in order to have a system, a model that was a deep learning model. Actually, it was a deep visual transformer network with more than 5 million coefficients. Could be trained to be generalizable enough across all these different skin tones and affections. And again, here we can regain the accuracy that would be lost by training data only on the local information from one single hospital without, again, the risks of exporting this data or sending this data around. And in terms of the regulatory framework, we have heard about the GDPR, the different translations of GDPR to member states, and also the Swiss, the new Federal Data Protection Act in Switzerland. We have done also the effort on translating all this technology and mapping this technology to the General Data Protection Regulation recitals, and how each of the techniques that are applied during the whole life cycle of the data can enable and can implement most of these privacy by design, security by design, data minimization, risk minimization properties and principles in order to make systems technologically compliant, of course always complemented by organizational measures that always have to be in place, but they can reduce the strain and the need of putting all these constraints and compliance into data protection agreements, signed agreements, or organizational measures by replacing the need of trust by the guarantees brought by the technology. And this also has been proposed, this specific combination of techniques, as a way of re-enabling international data collaborations according to Article 46 GDPR. That means for those countries or those non-member states for which there's no adequacy decision, it's possible to use these techniques complemented with standard contractual clauses in order to implement this collaboration or this data transfer without transfer of raw data across multiple sites. And this is just an example of an excerpt of the data protection impact assessment, just show the minimization of risks that is brought by the use of these technologies. And again, all this analysis comes together, automated by the platform in order to show to the decision makers, data protection officers, ethics committees, in order to enable a positive decision in enabling a given protocol. And I have just one last thing. I have not mentioned AI specifically. And there are also uses of AI that can be responsible in this setting by separating the data plane from the metadata plane that can directly and readily help in these cases. And one of the cases that we have already implemented in the platform is the use of AI in order to translate natural language into the complex but very powerful and expressive language that maps all the different data relations in order to bring a natural language query into the database language that can effectively implement this query across all different sites. So here we have an example that is actually misspelled, and we can translate directly this natural language query into the database format and the database language in order to run this query afterwards and validate that this query is actually the query that the user was intended to execute in the system without needing patient data or personal data in order to train these systems, and running these systems also locally at each of the different sites without exposing any information about the prompt to any other sites or any other organization in the network. Thanks for your attention, and if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you.